All right, welcome to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is going to be mostly about plant growth and development. The learning outcomes, to know the difference between plant growth and plant development and how we measure each of those. We're going to talk about the factors that are going to affect plant growth and development, and then understand how those factors can be manipulated to control plant growth and development. And finally, we'll talk about some of those plant hormones and how they're used. So plant growth is kind of what we will call the biomass or yield, right? That's why we're growing them, is because we're trying to gain some biomass or yield of some sort. So we can measure those in height and length, fresh and dry weight. So we do this in like hay production. For research purposes, we would collect the fresh weight, and then we would collect the dry weight, and then we would determine the dry matter yield. We can do it by volume, such as something like a bushel, or maybe a surface area, like for sod production. Plant growth occurs because cells divide, and then those cells enlarge. This is a picture of a poinsettia. The one on the left is not as developed compared to the one on the right. So for cell division, those meristematic cells, the meristematic cells will divide. Well, once they divide, they will begin to elongate. Then they will expand, so it becomes kind of long and then wide. So the genetics are going to have the most influence on the types of cells and the size of the cells, much like humans, right? So it is our DNA that actually determines how big we are, how tall we are, how much weight we gain. A little bit of that is going to also be what our diet is. So our genetics are going to be the primary thing that control the plant growth. And then finally, and then also with that is going to be the environment. So like the gene code gives the plant everything that it needs. And if you were to supply adequate amount of light, adequate amount of temperature, and also carbon dioxide and oxygen, if we were to give all of those in sufficient amounts, then the plant growth would be maximized. And so that's what we call max yield. If everything were perfect, if we gave it all the light, temperature, water, gases, and nutrients that we needed, some of y'all might have heard about producers trying to grow them, just doing whatever they can in order to maximize corn yield on like a 1 acre area. Probably the record is probably somewhere in 300 or 400 bushels per acre, right? But they're making sure that all the environmental conditions are at least optimum. They're making sure that they get all the nutrients, all the water that they need, the soil is the right, like everything has to be perfect, and then you can maximize the yield. Well, we know that not everything is perfect in our systems. So what we really look for is the optimum yield. So these plant hormones and some of the other metabolites that we're probably going to discuss in Chapter 8 are really the genetic portion of that. As we mentioned before, the light and the temperature are going to influence that gene activity. So they have these photoperiodic responses. They require short or long day periods. They require enough photosynthesis. They require enough light to perform photosynthesis. And once they have enough light, then those genes are activated. Also temperature. Again, I bring it back to plants and people. Like if it's dark outside and it's cold, I'm going to sleep, right? Plants are the same way. If it's dark outside and it's cold, they're not as active, if that makes any sense. Unless you're a cool season plant, but even then when the temperatures get so low, eventually they just stop functioning, or their function slows down. So for light, we have photosynthesis. We talked about this before. Plants are autotrophic. So they use that solar energy so that they can grow and develop. And some of the things that go into that are going to be the angle of incidence. And so one of the reasons that we have seasons and we have cool season and warm season grasses is the way that the sunlight actually hits the earth. The angle of incidence during the summertime, it's warm, there's going to be more daylight. It's the angle of incidence, it's the way that the earth is tilted and the way that the sun. So during the summertime we're tilted, no, turn that around. During the summertime we are tilted towards the sun, so the angle of incidence is actually closer when we're tilted this way. When it's winter time, it's tilted that way and the angle is tilted away from the sun and the angle of incidence is different. And that goes along with the light intensity. Next we have light quality, which is going to influence our photomorphogenesis. Light quality influences our photomorphogenesis. We have this thing called phytochrome, which is kind of the shade avoidance response. And so phytochrome is what is part of photosynthesis, and it is what is going to induce plant growth. We also have this thing called cryptochrome, which is based on our circadian rhythms. And circadian rhythms is kind of like it's kind of like an internal clock based upon a 24-hour period. And then we have phototropin, which is responsible for phototropism. And so the plant, like a good example of phototropism is sunflower. They will face the sun and they will follow the sun, so that is phototropism. They are growing towards the sun because they're trying to get as much of that energy as they can. And that is caused by phototropin. So in this picture here, on this far right, they blocked out the far red but not the red, and you can see this kind of short stunted growth. We still have the flowers that are roughly about, I don't see any major differences between, there's some between these flowers and these flowers, but they're short and stunted and compacted, right? So they have not grown up and out. In the middle, they grew this under normal sunlight conditions. This is kind of typical of what we would see, medium statured plant, a little bit taller than this one, and a little bit more open. And then finally here on the left, this plant is really tall, kind of sparse in between here. It's not as compacted because it has, because we blocked out that red and not the far red, and so now there's a phototropic, there's a response trying to get closer to the red light. So that's that shade avoidance that we were talking about. Next, we also have these photoperiodic responses, and this goes along with the season. Some of you might have heard of short day and long day plants. And so because of the day length is actually going to influence when these plants start to flower. And because we know this, we can induce some of these short and long day periods in order to make the plants do what we would like them to do. I think one of the common examples is poinsettias. Poinsettias are grown specifically in the wintertime. They have to manipulate the light strategy and the temperature strategy in order to make those plants available for Christmas. It's also going to influence dormancy. And so once you go from a long day, since we're in the summertime, once the day changes from long day to day neutral, from long day to short day, so after June 21st, is it? Yeah, June 21st is the summer solstice. At that point, the days will begin to get shorter. Once those days start to get shorter, at some point in time, somewhere around September 21st, when it becomes very short day lengths in the autumn equinox, and so that's when the day lengths are are 12 hours each. Those overwintering survival structures, that shortening of light is the cue to the plant that says, hey, it's getting to be about that time again. You know what you need to do. We need to start developing these overwintering survival structures. So the light is what kind of triggers the plant to do. It's like the cue that says, hey, ding, it's starting to get shorter days. You know what that means. It's about to get dark earlier, so we need to go ahead and start going into winter mode and start becoming dormant and start hibernating almost, right? And it also has some response for vegetative reproduction. Next, our temperature. Temperature is based on season, right? Because of the angle of incidence. And so right now we're in the summer. The earth is tilted more towards the sun. We are intercepting more of that solar radiation, and it's hot. So plants that are warm season plants that need high temperatures, like cotton. Cotton is one of those plants that its plant growth is primarily dictated with temperature. There's not much more you can influence other than temperature. So when temperature increases, cotton growth increases. When it decreases, so does cotton growth. And so that's kind of why everyone used to always ask me, like, how come they don't grow cotton up here? I was like, well, there's not enough temperature. There aren't enough growing degree days. And we'll go over growing degree days here in a moment. But there's just not enough heat during the season in order for the plant to finish its life cycle. And each plant has a minimum, an optimum, and a maximum. And so when we talk about maximum temperatures, I don't know that we ever get, I guess in Tennessee, y'all might not get maximum temperatures that would be very detrimental to most of our common plants. I guess if I rethink about that, like there's a reason why some plants don't grow in the summertime. It's because their maximum temperature doesn't allow for it. But when we start getting into very high temperature effects, when we start getting over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, we start getting up to like 110, 115, 120, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, like plants just can't grow there. They have this protoplasm destruction, and they'll end up getting solarization and sun scald. Like there's too much temperature, because you have to think about, if the temperature ever gets that high, the angle of incidence and the intensity of the light is very high. And so they are just incapable of withstanding that solar radiation. It's just like whenever we go out in the sun on the lake, our skin burns. Same principle here with the plants. Likewise, we have low temperature effects, which are going to be frost damage and chilling. So my uncle grows satsumas, and one of the problems that he has is once the and this is on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So once the temperature warms up in April, and also the change in the light as the day length starts to increase, because the spring equinox is in March 21st. So about April, the day length starts to get longer, and we're also shifting, and so we're starting to get warmer temperatures. So he grows satsumas. Those satsumas start to grow, and they produce the flowers. Well, I guess kind of like here in Tennessee, every once in a while we might get a cold snap that comes through in April or maybe early May. And so he has 5 acres out there that is not protected by a greenhouse. If those flowers start to bloom, and then he gets a frost or a cold snap, he runs the risk of losing his crop. So plants just can't handle those low temperatures once they've reached certain stages. However, some of these low temperature effects have some benefit. We can use seed stratification, and this is where we go from where we have a lot of seed and a lot, as in not in like a quantity of a lot, but a group being a lot, like a bag. So we have a bag of seed, and we have a bunch of those bags of seed, and we put them in like cold storage, because they need that cold period in order to germinate. That temperature sends a signal to the seed that once it reaches enough chilling days, that finally that structure can then begin to develop. So we can have seed stratification, which is going to improve our germination. Vernalization is going to be about flowering. Apples and peaches, those satsumas, they need this cold period in order to initiate the flowering portion of their life cycle. And I want you to consider something. Think about our winters now. What's happening with our winters? They're getting shorter, and the temperatures are not as cold. So we're running into problems. Just a few years ago, when we had a couple of very mild winters, and the apples there was no vernalization period for the trees. My uncle had the same problem. So again, the same situation. We went down there and we were like, I was expecting this big orchard and it was supposed to have a bunch of fruit on it, and we were like, well, man, he didn't know what happened. Like, what's going on? How come his crop was not as big as it once was the year before? Well, we had a mild winter, and so there was not enough vernalization period for those buds to actually undergo their processes so that they can produce the flowers. And the flowers is what produces the fruit. So if we don't have vernalization, they don't get that cold period for extended and consistently. They don't produce the flowers. If they don't produce the flowers, they don't produce the fruit. So this cold period, we're about to run into a big problem as our temperatures and our climate start to change, and we have this climate encroachment where the temperatures are starting to increase as we move more northern in the United States. So just something to think about, how temperature is actually influencing our fruits. And then finally, dormancy breaking. So there's this chilling requirement. It's much like we have this a warming requirement. We need to have our soil temperatures to be the right, like 55 degrees. They need to be that consistently. We need to have moisture. We also have it the other way, where those seeds need to undergo some chilling requirement before they can germinate or break dormancy. So kind of part of seed stratification. And then cold and freeze tolerance. No brainer here, water is necessary for the biological processes. And I mentioned in soils, in the chapter about soils, that water is how those nutrients and those metabolites get into the plant. We also need water. Again, I'm making that comparison between plants and humans. It's going to help with temperature control, and then primarily with this cell structure. And so we have two types of cells. We have turgid cells, and turgid cells are going to be full. And then also flaccid cells, which are going to be kind of flat. So our turgid cells are going to end up being large, but they have thin cell walls and can lead to long and weak stems. Our flaccid cells are small, but they have thick cell walls, and they will lead to short and strong stems. And so we have both of these turgid and flaccid cells in the stem that are giving it its structure, and they both perform different functions. Gases, the two primary gases that we need are going to be carbon dioxide, and we need this for photosynthesis, and then finally also oxygen. The plants, they will respire under respiration, and plant roots are going to need oxygen. We also need oxygen for some of those transport, like we talked about in soils, where we have 45% mineral, 5% organic matter, and then air and water split between the other two. There are some processes that happen where those gases need to be given off, and so we don't want to have compacted soils, or we don't want to have a lack of those gases for our plant growth. So we have 4 stages of growth. We have, obviously, the seed needs to germinate, and then there will be early seedling growth. The plant will grow vegetatively, so it will begin to put out leaves and stems that are going to support the flowers and the fruit, which are the reproductive growth and development. And we'll go into that a little bit later in this chapter. And then finally, aging and senescence. And so senescence is the end of the life cycle. So when plants start to senesce, if you've seen corn in September, it has already ran its process. It is going to terminate. We call those leaves senesced. Or maybe you've seen some leaves that fall off. Leaves on trees in the fall time have senesced. So during early germination, the first thing we need to do is imbibe that water. We need to imbibe water to begin the plant processes within the seed. Once that water is imbibed, we will begin, that is going to increase the biological activity. It will start some enzymes, and then the seed will start to use those energy reserves. So here we see the radicle and the shoot emerging on this right here. So standard bean, not planted, then we have a bean that's imbibed water, and then finally the radicle and the shoot start to emerge. So this is, I guess when I think about this, I think about when I'm making a pot of kidney beans, right? Or red beans and rice, and you may have seen your mom do this. She'll put the beans in water so that they'll fill up. And once they start to fill up, so like this is really condensed, right? Nothing, there's no movement, there's no gases. We need the water to imbibe so that we can start to fill those cells with water, and then we create enough space, and then finally the radicle and the shoot can then emerge. So for our vegetative growth, roots and shoots, our vegetative is going to be mostly roots and shoots. We have radical emergence, and then our roots are going to grow into the soil in balance with our shoot growth. And so you can think about that there needs to be just as much root growth below the soil as there is shoot growth above the soil so that it can support it. If you have a plant that is not very much above the soil, then the root system is going to be very shallow. So when we cut grass, there's no need for the roots to grow any longer, because they're only supporting, that much turf grass. But think about a corn plant being almost this tall, almost 5 foot tall. There needs to be an extensive root system to support the plant, and then also provide all the nutrients for a 5 foot tall corn plant. So there's going to be a balance between the root and the shoot growth. For shoot growth and also vegetative shoot growth, we have two growth types. One is determinate, which means that at a certain point it will only grow to be so tall. And then we have indeterminate, which means the plant, you don't know where it's going to grow. You don't know how much it's going to grow. And it may continue to keep on growing, like vines. Vines would be an indeterminate plant. It doesn't just stop at 6. Next we have vegetative patterns, and so there are 3 classes of plants. What we call annuals, which means they complete their life cycle in one growing season. That makes sense, right? An annual, we have to renew we have to plant annuals every year. They do not come back after they complete their life cycle. Next we have biennials, bi meaning 2. So it takes 2 growing seasons in order to complete that life cycle. So there will be kind of the vegetative growth in the first season, and then in the second season it will complete its life cycle by flowering and reproducing. And then we have perennials, and perennials come back every year. So we can plant a perennial, we don't have to worry about replanting it. So Something you might think about that this is corn. We have to plant corn every growing season. A biennial might be something like carrots. Carrots require 2 years worth of growth in order to complete their life cycle. And then perennials, cotton is actually a perennial. So we could leave the cotton there and harvest it the next year, but we don't. It's just too much to manage over the winter. And then also the plant's just gonna die anyhow. So what we do is, after it completes its life cycle, we just cut everything down, disc it up maybe, come back and replant again. This graph is, this figure is showing kind of the life cycle of how many days is this? I think this ended up being 4 months. In 4 months, to accomplish in 4 months. If you think about corn, we're gonna plant corn. About a week later, it's going to emerge. It will undergo our vegetative growth, so about 45 days. Sometime in, let me start back here. So typically, where I'm from in Mississippi, we plant corn about the end of March, so April 1st. About April 7th, 8th, we've got emergence. Somewhere we'll go another 45 days, so that's about the middle of July. We'll start to tassel, and flowers will start. We have flower emergence, opening, pollination, and then finally that fruit grows. So June, July, somewhere about either the middle of August or the beginning of September, the fruit has matured, so the corn has matured. It's reached physiological maturity, it's dried down, so it's reached physiological maturity. And then we need another month or so for it to dry down so that we can harvest it. So now we're in the middle of September, getting to be close to the end of August. And that's all based on the genetics of the plant. So they have maturity dates of corn plants, and they're, well, you know, like a 105-day maturity plant. 105 days to maturity, which is about 4 months. We have 110 days to maturity, which may be like a month and a third. So we're, that wouldn't be right. 120 days is 4 months. So we have these short season varieties, 100 days, 105, and they complete this life cycle earlier based on growing season, which is again going back to temperature. So here's this is a hollyhock. On the left, this is the first year's growth. So we have a lot of vegetation, a lot of vegetative growth that's going to establish these leaves. These leaves are going to perform photosynthesis, and they will store that photosynthesis over during the first year. There's going to be a light initiation, and then finally during the second year, they will begin to flower. This is the growth and development curve for a biennial. So here we are first summer. Here's our vegetative growth somewhere in the middle of winter. So here we are probably about February. We will get a flower initiation. Maybe this is March. We have flower initiation, and then finally we have another growth spurt. It will flower, and then the plant will die. It will give off the seed, and then have to repeat this cycle all over again. Perennials are just going to continue to grow. Each year they are going to come back. The shoots may die in the winter, but new shoots will emerge in the springtime. We also have some woody types where the roots and the shoots may remain alive, or they may go dormant in the wintertime, but they will come back. So trees are perennials. We do not have to replant trees every year. This graph is showing our herbaceous perennials, where we have a growth in the summertime. During the fall, it will be dormant, and the next spring it comes back. And then also the same thing with this line being our garden chrysanthemum or things such as that. So at some point in time, there's going to be a phase change. And again, I'm going to bring this back to humans. There's a point in time when we are juvenile. So, or there's a point in time when we hit puberty. Like 13 or 14, all of a sudden our bodies start to change, more hormones are being produced, and our bodies undergo different changes. Well, the same thing happens in plants. So they have this juvenility or this juvenile stage where it's only vegetative. And then after a certain period of time that's triggered by light, it enters, it becomes mature and enters into the reproductive phase. And then finally it undergoes senescence, and then the plant will die. So how about, let's say, elementary and middle school, high school, at getting out of high school, college, your career, and then finally the end of life. Maybe kind of a time frame to think about how that goes. So during the juvenile phase, that duration is going to be based on species, so the genetics of that species and how that plant grows. But it could be from a few days, or it could be a few years. And so because of that, we have a problem in our breeding programs. So the longer that the plant stays juvenile, the longer the breeding program is going to take, because the breeding is part of the pollination of that flower. So one way that we can differentiate juvenile and mature may be by looking at the leaf shape or the arrangement on the stem, and then also the presence or absence of thorns. So in this picture, we can see our leaves are like, the shape is kind of like an arrowhead here. No seeds, no flowers. Here we have flowers, and those edges have now filled out, and it is more like a spear. Excuse me. Ooh. So when we start to go into the reproductive phase of this, there are going to be three kind of flowering phases. That first one is going to be induction and initiation, and this is going to have to do with temperature and light. And so as light starts to either increase or decrease, depending on short day or long day, that there are going to be some signals and some cues and some hormones that get released, and the meristematic tissue will start to divide and differentiate into flowering cells. Next, there will be a flower signal that as the light increases, and then flower development. So flower induction and initiation, flower signal, and flower development. This is going to be kind of on the edge. This is going to be that transition phase from juvenile to mature. Next, there will be pollination and fertilization. And we need the flowers there first in order for the pollination and the fertilization to occur. Then finally, the fruit will set, and then the fruit will grow and develop, and then finally be harvested. So at some point in time during the growing season, the light will change. As the plant starts to grow, the light The light intensity and duration may change. We have flower induction and initiation. Flower signal. This is the plant telling this is sunlight. There's a signal to the plant that says start to flower. And then finally, flower development. Once the flower is fully developed, the potential to pollinate is there. The flower will become, or the ovary will become fertilized with the pollen. The fruit will begin to set, and then the fruit will grow and develop. And then finally, the plant will age and senesce. So as I mentioned before, that bare stemmatic tissue, there's going to be a change from vegetative to reproductive, and that is when flowering is induced. Typically at some morphological age, and that difference can be, it's dependent on species from days to years. It's the environment that signals this flower induction. For instance, temperature. We have growing degree days, or maybe there's going to be, we need that vernalization that I was talking about. And then light. So here we are back again with our environmental factors that are going to trigger the change between maturity, or juvenility and maturity. So our heat accumulation, you might have heard the term growing degree days. This is how we can kind of estimate what growth stage our plants are going to be at. And so growing degree days are calculated very easily. We take the max temperature plus the min temperature and divide by 2. So this is the mean temperature of the day. And so if the temperature is 90 degrees, if the high is 90, and the low is 72, 90 plus 72 is 162. Divided by 2 equals 81. The basic math calculation there. Depending on the crop, you might have this standard of where we measure how many growing degree days we have. So you'll typically either see this as growing degree day 50 or maybe growing degree day 60. So we take 81 and subtract the 50 from it, and so we have accumulated 31 growing degree days today, right? And so you'll accumulate those over time. So at the end of a week, you might have, 200 growing degree days. As I mentioned before with my Uncle Satsuma farm, there's going to be this vernalization period that is required. And if you do not get adequate vernalization period at a certain temperature based on the species, then you won't get flower induction. And if the flower doesn't induce, then you don't set fruit. If you don't set fruit, you don't make any money this year. And guess what? How do you freeze? It's one thing for us to increase the temperature. There are ways we can go about that. How do you go about chilling a 5-acre field? You can't, right? And now think about, they're doing this on thousands of acres. So the citrus industry is really at the mercy of the environment. Some examples of that vernalization, biennials, tulips, lilies, some of our bulbs. Winter wheat. We don't plant winter wheat in the spring. We plant it in the fall because we need that cooling period in order to initiate the grain yield. And then there's also a way where we can force these ornamental bulbs to flower by exposing them to cold temperatures. So this would be in a greenhouse, right? And so we can put these out in outside or in a cooler somewhere to for that vernalization period, and then bring them into a warm greenhouse and give the plant kind of a pseudo spring or a pseudo summer. So it undergoes this cold period, and then poof, it feels like it's spring or summer outside, and the plant will start to grow. So we can kind of manipulate the environment in order to make plants do what we would like them to do. Another one of those ways is light. And so light is going to influence those meristematic changes that are going to initiate flowering. If there's not enough light, there won't be enough photosynthesis. So it's kind of like the plant's way of going, is there enough to sustain my growth? And that is light, because light is what drives photosynthesis. It'd be just like us, kind of like going, is there enough oxygen to support life? How much oxygen is there? Because if there's not a lot of oxygen, like, I guess something that's kind of out there as a thought process would be like Mars, right? So we're looking to try and see if there's a possibility if we could live on another planet or the moon. There's not enough oxygen there for us to go live there easily, right? So we're just going to hold off on that. Same thing with light for plants. If there's not enough light, then it's not going to waste its energy or put that out just for the plant to die. We mentioned before about the short day length and long day length and day neutral. If we can manipulate the critical day length, we can I say trick the plant into flowering when it's not necessarily ready to flower under natural conditions. So we can either create long days or short days. We can put shade cloth over greenhouses to make the plants do what we want them to. This figure is showing kind of the difference between short day and long day plants. And we see that we have kind of this flip-flop, because during long day plants, when the light is longer, we will initiate the flowering. During long days, when the day length is longer, our short day plants are vegetative. When we reverse that and we change the day length, and now we have short days, our short day plants are flowering, our long day plants have now gone into vegetative state. There's not enough light for a long day plant to flower. So we can create those short days, as I mentioned before, by putting shade cloth over the greenhouse. If we wanted to create long days, then we would add lighting. We would add artificial lighting. I mentioned before about the circadian rhythm. So that circadian rhythm is a biological rhythm that repeats every 24 hours. If we disrupt that rhythm, we disrupt the growth of the plant. All right, that's going to end section 7.1. We have one more section in chapter 7, and I think there's only one section for chapter 8. Okay? See you in the next chapter.